Tailwind CSS is one of the most popular CSS frameworks that is out there today. And in this video, I'm going to show you a few different ways to install it so that you can start using it inside of your projects. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and my goal is to help break down the complexities of modern web development for common coders like you and me. In this video, we're going to learn a few different ways to install Tailwind CSS so that we can start taking advantage of this powerful CSS library. Now, before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. However, I'm going to be going through all of this from scratch, so you're more than welcome to follow along, even if you're not super familiar with everything on this list. But to get the most out of this video, you're going to want to have a basic understanding of HTML and CSS. You're going to want to be familiar with how to use the command line or the terminal on your machine. You'll also want to be somewhat familiar with npm and how to install different packages and libraries into your project. Now, all of this sample code will be available on GitHub, so it'll be helpful if you understand how to work with Git and GitHub. And I'm talking specifically about things like branches and commits, because I'm going to be using those to essentially save my work and show the different installation methods using various branches inside of my repository. Now, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code exclusively throughout this video, but you should be able to follow along with the editor of your choice. I prefer Visual Studio Code just because it has a lot of cool integrated features. I like the CSS and HTML support that comes right out of the box. And it also has pretty good Tailwind support in the form of the Tailwind extension. Now, like I mentioned, I'm going to be building this project from scratch to show the different installation methods, but feel free to use the chapters at the bottom of this video or down in the description to skip to the installation method that's going to work best for you. I also have videos on several of these topics if you want some additional information. Those topics would be the ones here with the purple bullet points, and you can find links to those videos down in the description below. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and learn how to install Tailwind CSS. All right, so there are 4 different ways that we can install Tailwind CSS into our projects. Now, we're going to cover these in more detail as we work through the different installation methods, but just know that these are the most common ways of working with Tailwind CSS. So we can either use Vite, which is a build tool for front-end projects. We can use PostCSS, which is a library for transforming CSS via JavaScript. We can use Tailwind's own CLI, which allows us to work with Tailwind in a wide variety of different projects, or we can load the Tailwind library, and this would be the entire library, from a CDN like Tailwind's own Play CDN, or a more common CDN like Unpkg. Now, you can find more information about all of these installation methods at tailwindcss.com/docs/installation. Now, the first way that we can install Tailwind CSS is to use Vite. Now, if you're not familiar with Vite, Vite is a fast and modern development and build tool for front-end projects. Now, I'm going to be using Vite to not only scaffold my project, but also to show you how to install Tailwind through the Vite plugin. But then I'm also going to be using Vite throughout the rest of the demo to show you the other installation methods. And that's because one of the features of Vite is that it comes with a development server, which is going to allow me to demo all of the different installation methods, even if we're not using the Vite plugin. So let's go ahead and create our project. All right, so getting started with Vite is actually super simple. What we're gonna go ahead and do is open up a terminal or a command line on your machine. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. And I like to keep all my projects in a folder called code. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and CD into my code folder. And then what I'm gonna do is use npm to scaffold a new Vite project. So in order to do that, what we need to do is type npm create and then Vite at latest. All right, and this will use the latest version of the Vite tool. Go ahead and hit enter, and it's going to tell me that I need to install the following packages. So it's going to download the latest version of Vite so I can use it. I'm gonna go ahead and type Y for yes and hit enter. And then it's asking me for a project name. So I'll go ahead and call this Tailwind installation demo. Hope I spelled installation right. All right, and then it's going to ask what type of framework do I want to use. So this is one of the cool things about Vite. It lets you kind of scaffold a bunch of different kinds of projects. I really don't need any of these here, so I'm going to go ahead and just select the vanilla JavaScript. And I don't really care about TypeScript at this point in time, so I'm just going to make it a JavaScript only project. So go ahead and hit enter, and then basically it creates the project. So you can see it says scaffolding project in my folder here. Now go ahead and run these commands, which basically is to cd into that directory, run npm install, and then launch the server. So let's go ahead and do that. Say cd tailwind installation demo, npm install. It's going to install all the dependencies. And before I run it, I'm going to go ahead and open up this project in Visual Studio Code by typing code. And then from this point forward, I'm going to go ahead and use the Visual Studio Code built-in terminal, which you can toggle by pressing Control-tilde, which is also the same as the backtick character on your keyboard. And this should work on both Mac and Windows. All right, so let's go ahead and see what we have to work with. You can see that it created this node modules folder, which is all my dependencies, created a public folder, which is where my assets are going to go. I have my source code, a git ignore, and my package.json, which you can see my dev dependency is Vite, that's my server, and I don't have any other dependencies here. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and initialize this as a new Git repository. So I'm going to type git init, and then go ahead and commit this as my first commit. So all of these files here that were added by Vite, I'm going to go ahead and commit these. Now, if you're following along, you don't have to do the git commands if you don't want to. I'm going to be sharing this source code via GitHub, so I need to do this as I work throughout the demo, but you can totally skip this if you're not working with Git. So I'll go ahead and type git add dot, and then git commit -m, and then initial commit. All right, so now we have a project to work with. Let's go ahead and run it. We'll say npm run dev. All right, and so this is what it looks like out of the box. We have this hello Vite, we have a little counter button, so on and so forth. So we're gonna take all this stuff out so that way we can start working with Tailwind. So let's go ahead and go into the index.html. I want to keep the script file, but let's go in here and we're basically going to not treat this as kind of a single page application. So we can go ahead and just get rid of all of the document query selector code here. I don't need the counter. I don't need to import the logos or anything like that. And let's go ahead and get rid of the counter as well. So the only thing I really need is the style.css. So if I save that, go back to my browser, you can see that there's nothing here. And let's go into the HTML real quick. And inside of the HTML, let's go ahead and get rid of the div ID of app. And so with the empty div, let's just go ahead and put an H1 in here that says hello world. All right, and so we can see that we have our hello world code over here on the left. Looks like it's centered in the middle of the screen. Let's go ahead and see if we can get that directly into the middle of the screen by modifying the CSS. And it looks like we can do that in the CSS here where the place items is in the center. Let's go ahead and just remove this and we'll say align items center and then also justify content center. All right, there we go. So we can see that back on my Vite app, my hello world is in the center. Let's go ahead and close the dev tools here. And now we can work on installing Tailwind so that way we can use Tailwind inside of this project. All right, so now that we have a baseline to work with, we're ready to install Tailwind. And what I've done is created a branch for the Vite installation called Tailwind Vite. So if you're following along using the code from the repository, you can find the finished code for this inside of the Tailwind Vite branch. All right, so what we need to do to install Tailwind is go ahead and use npm or whatever package manager that you're using and type npm install Tailwind CSS, and then also the Tailwind CSS plugin for Vite, which is at Tailwind CSS/Vite. So go ahead and hit enter. And then after a minute, we can see in our package.json, you can see that we have dependencies for Tailwind CSS/Vite, which is the plugin, and then the Tailwind CSS library itself. Now, the next thing we need to do is go ahead and add the plugin to our Vite config file. Now you can see in this project, we don't have one. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and create one. So I'm gonna go ahead and click in the empty space here, go up to the top and click the new file button. And I'll go ahead and call this vite.config.js. And at the top of this file, we need to import two different things. The first is the define config method from Vite. So that's going to be import, and then in curly braces, it's going to be define config from Vite. And then we also need to import the Tailwind plugin for Vite, which is going to be import Tailwind CSS from at Tailwind CSS/Vite. Now, the next thing that we need to do is go ahead and use the define config method to add our Tailwind CSS plugin. And we're going to export the result of that. So what we're going to do is say export default define config, and that's going to take a configuration object, which is going to have a plugins property. And then inside of that plugins property, which is an array, we're going to go ahead and call the Tailwind CSS function. Now, the next thing that we need to do is go ahead and add an import to our CSS file to import the Tailwind styles. So let's go into our style.css and go all the way to the top above the root, and then go ahead and add an @ import and then Tailwind CSS. Let's go ahead and save that. And to test this out, let's go ahead and run our app. So we'll say npm run dev. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit smaller on our screen and set this up side by side. And so here is our hello world that we saw a little bit earlier. And you can already tell from what we saw before that we have a different font here, and we are receiving this font from Tailwind. So we can tell that it's working. Let's go ahead and verify that by adding a couple Tailwind classes to our H1. So let's go ahead and say class equals, and then let's go ahead and just make this a little bit bolder by saying font dash bold, and then also giving it an underline by adding the underline class. Let's go ahead and save that. And now you can see that our hello world is now bold, and we do have the underline. And so Tailwind CSS is now working successfully inside of our Vite project. Now, just to have a little fun underneath the H1, let's go ahead and add a button, and we're going to make this button say subscribe. All right, so you can see that looks okay. It's not quite where I want it, but that's okay. Now I have some styles that were part of the initial Vite starter project that's giving it this look. So let's go ahead and get rid of those. Find those in our style sheet, which is going to be right here. All of these button styles gotta go. All right, so there we go. So this doesn't look like a button at all. So let's go ahead and fix that. So let's go into our index.html and let's go ahead and give it some classes. So let's say class rounded full, and then BG red 600. All right, so we're getting there. Let's go ahead and give it a little bit of padding. So we'll say PX6. So that's going to be padding on the left and right, and then PY, we'll give it some padding of 2, so make it kind of skinny. There we go. And then the text is already white, but let's go ahead and just set that anyway. So we'll say text white, font bold. All right, so that looks a little bit better. And then let's give it a little bit of a shadow. So we'll say shadow -LG. And then what we're going to do is give it a hover, and that hover is going to be hover BG red 700. So now when I hover over it, it'll change color a little bit. And then what we want to do is give that a little bit of a transition too. So we'll say transition, and then the duration of that transition is going to be 300, which is 300 milliseconds. And so now when I hover over it, you can see it kind of fades in and out. Probably doesn't show on the video, but now we have a subscribe button that looks a little bit more like the YouTube subscribe button. All right, let's go ahead and fix this so it's in the center underneath the hello world. So we'll go ahead and just add another div underneath here. Then we'll go ahead and take our button and then stick it inside of that div, which as of right now, we don't see any changes because we need to add some styles to the div. So we'll say class equals text center. So that puts it in the center, and then we'll go ahead and add some margin to the top, and we'll just add 5. There we go. So hello world, we got our subscribe button, and now we can successfully use Tailwind inside of this project. So now that we know how to install Tailwind using Vite, let's go ahead and learn how to install it with PostCSS. All right, so the second way to install Tailwind CSS is to use PostCSS. Now PostCSS is a library for transforming and enhancing CSS through the use of JavaScript plugins. Now PostCSS can be used with or without Vite. So if your project already has PostCSS, this is probably the method that you want to use. But one of the cool things about Vite is that it supports PostCSS right out of the box as long as you have a valid PostCSS configuration file. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and install the Tailwind library, PostCSS, and the PostCSS plugin for Tailwind. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we're back in our project here, and we're now on a new branch called Tailwind PostCSS. And if we go ahead and start the server using npm run dev, you can see that we have the hello world and the subscribe button from the Vite demo, and we've left the Tailwind classes in place. So if we go ahead and look at our index.html, you can see that we have our Tailwind classes here, but they're not being applied since Tailwind is not installed, and there's nothing to process these classes and create the Tailwind CSS file. And so we're going to go ahead and install PostCSS to go ahead and do that for us. So what we want to do, let's go ahead and stop our server, and let's go ahead and install our dependencies. So we're going to go ahead and do npm install, and then Tailwind CSS. And then we want PostCSS, and then we also want the @Tailwind CSS / PostCSS plugin. All right, so we're installing the Tailwind library, PostCSS, which is going to process our Tailwind classes. And then in order to do that, we need the Tailwind plugin in order to process those classes. So let's go ahead and hit enter. All right, and you can see in our package.json, we have the Tailwind library, PostCSS, and then the PostCSS plugin for Tailwind. So in order to get this to work, what we need to do is create a PostCSS configuration file. So I'm gonna go ahead and click into the open area here to make sure I'm on the root. Go ahead and click add new file, and this file is called postcss.config.js. All right, now what we're gonna do is go ahead and export default, and we're just going to export an object here, and that object is going to have a plugins property, and that plugins property in this case is an object, not an array. So I'm going to have an object here, and then the key, our first key is going to be the Tailwind plugin. So we'll say Tailwind CSS / PostCSS, and then the value for that is just going to be an empty object. All right, so once we have this in place, then all we need to do is go into our style.css, go all the way up to the top, and then import Tailwind CSS. All right, so with all that set up, we should be able to launch the server. So npm run dev, go ahead and jump over to our browser. All right, you can see that we have the bold hello world with the underline as specified by what's in our index.html. So there's the font bold underline, but notice we don't have the button classes. And if you remember from the Vite demo, that's because the default has a style for that button, which is down here on line 69. So we'll go ahead and get rid of all of this. Delete that, go ahead and save it. And it seemed to be a little stuck. So once I went ahead and refreshed the page, we now have our red subscribe button. And so this is how we can install Tailwind into a project using PostCSS. Again, this could be a Vite-based project. It could be a completely different project using PostCSS. It just has to have some way for PostCSS to run that Tailwind plugin. And there's a variety of different ways to do that depending on your project type. But if your project type has PostCSS, all you need to do is download Tailwind and the Tailwind plugin. Make sure you add it to your PostCSS configuration file, and then import Tailwind CSS into your main style sheet, which is what we're doing here at the top. And then from there, you should be good to go. All right, the third way to install Tailwind CSS is to use Tailwind's own CLI or command line interface. Now, this is Tailwind's own tool for compiling and optimizing classes. And this is a good choice if you aren't using any other build tool, but still want to take advantage of Tailwind CSS. So let's go ahead and see how this works. All right, so back over in VS Code, I have created a new branch called Tailwind CLI. And what we're going to do is go ahead and modify this project to use the Tailwind CLI. Now, this method would probably be more useful in a project that wasn't using a build tool, but the concepts will be more or less the same whether you're using a build tool or not. So if we go ahead and start up our project, let's say npm run dev, you can see we just have our base styles. We have our hello world with our button. And what I'm going to do before we forget, let's go ahead and go into our style.css and remove those button styles. So that way we don't have the same problem that we had in the previous one where the Tailwind styles were not applying. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And then to get these on top of each other, we need to go ahead and modify our body. So that way the flex direction is column, which I think Tailwind takes care of, which is why it works in those other cases. But here we go. So we got hello world, we got our subscribe button. And so let's go ahead and install Tailwind into this project using the Tailwind CLI. So what we want to do is go ahead and shut down our dev server, and we'll go ahead and run npm install Tailwind CSS. And then we want the @Tailwind CSS /CLI. All right, and so what this does is it installs the base Tailwind library, which is going to give us our base styles. And so we can actually see that if we go into our style.css and go ahead and import Tailwind right up here at the top. So we'll say import Tailwind CSS, and that needs to be an @import. There we go. All right, so now if we go ahead and start this up, so we can see the base Tailwind styles being applied, right? We got a different font here. It's removed all of our margins and padding and all that other stuff, but it's not picking up our custom Tailwind CSS classes. And that is because something needs to scan our files in order to see what classes we're using in order for Tailwind to generate the appropriate CSS. Now, using the Tailwind CLI, this process is a little different than using the plugins. And so what we need to do is go ahead and run the CLI. So that way it'll pick up those classes and add it to our CSS file. But in order for it to do that, we need to have an input CSS file and an output CSS file. So what I need to do here is go ahead and take this style.css, which is being imported by our main.js file here. We're going to go ahead and change this. We'll rename it to style-input. Now, if we run the dev server now, we're not going to have any styles at all, right? So let's go ahead and run that. You can see that we don't have anything at all because our style.css doesn't exist. So we got a lot of broken stuff here. So let's go ahead and fix that. So what we need to do is go into our package.json and let's go ahead and add a Tailwind script to trigger the Tailwind CLI. So we'll say Tailwind is going to be the script name, and that's going to run npx @Tailwind CSS-CLI, and then it's going to take an input file through a -i flag, and that's going to be ./src/style-input.css, and then that's going to dump it out into an output file, which is going to be ./src/style.css. And so that's the file that our JavaScript references here. And so what Tailwind's going to do, once we tell it to, we're going to go ahead and watch this for changes. Don't forget our comma. And so now we have a Tailwind script that's going to run the CLI. And so let's go ahead and stop the dev server and just go ahead and run that Tailwind script. So we'll say npm run Tailwind All right, and you can see that what it did is look at our input file and dumped out our output file, and it scanned all of our files in order to generate this file. And so you can see here's a lot of the base Tailwind styles. And if we scroll down all the way to where we see this layer for utilities, which on my screen is going to be line 171. These are the classes that we use in our HTML. So there's the MT5, there's the rounded full, BG red, so on and so forth. So if we look at our index.html, those styles are coming from here. So like I mentioned a little earlier, the way Tailwind works is that it scans your files for the classes that you're using and then generates the appropriate CSS file based on those classes. And so that's exactly what's happening here inside of our style.css. And so once we have the kind of Tailwind CLI running, we can open up another terminal and then run npm run dev. Okay, so there's kind of two parts when you use the Tailwind CLI. You need to have whatever's hosting your server and then whatever's running the CLI. So that's why using a build tool is a little bit more convenient, because you can do both of those things in one step. So now if I go back to my local host, you can see that those styles have been applied. And now I have my bold underline hello world along with my red subscribe button. And so that is how you use Tailwind with the Tailwind CLI. And like I said, you can use that in any type of project. It doesn't have to be Vite. You can just use a regular static HTML page, and you can use the Tailwind CLI to go ahead and generate your CSS file for you with the needed Tailwind CSS classes. All right, the last and final way to use Tailwind CSS in your project is to use it via a CDN. Now, this is not a recommended way to use Tailwind unless you're just trying to learn how to use it or just working with it in development. And that is because the full Tailwind CSS file can be very, very large. However, it is an option, and we'll go ahead and see how to set that up. All right, so back over here in VS Code, you can see I am on a new branch called Tailwind-CDN. And if we go ahead and run our project, so let's say npm run dev, we can see that we have our hello world and our subscribe button. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remove the default styles that came with the Vite project. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. So remember, for our subscribe button, the Tailwind classes that we're using. So we're giving it some rounded corners and a background, and we're changing the padding and a bunch of other stuff here. So in order for this stuff to work, we need to remove the styles that came from the Vite starter project. So we'll go ahead and go to the button styles here and delete those. All right, now if we go back to the project, we can see this doesn't look very good. So let's go ahead and add Tailwind to the project using the CDN. And we can get those from a very popular CDN, which hosts all kinds of unpackaged NPM packages called Unpkg. And so what we want to do is go back into Visual Studio Code and then go into our index.html file. And to add Tailwind from the CDN, we need to go up into the head of our index.html, and we actually need to add this as a script tag. So we'll go ahead and create a script tag, and then for the source is going to be https:// and then unpkg, which is unpkg.com /@tailwindcss, which is the library name, /browser @4. And so that's Tailwind version 4. So this is why we're getting browser @4. All right, now you can see on our page here, we have our bold and underlined hello world along with our nifty little subscribe button. So like I mentioned before, this method of using Tailwind isn't really recommended for anything other than development. And that is because the Tailwind CSS file can be very, very large, especially in older versions of Tailwind. It seems like in the newer versions, it's using JavaScript to kind of manipulate and optimize the file for you. But again, that's going to take a toll on browser performance. So it's really recommended to have something pre-process that CSS for you, either through the use of the Tailwind CLI or the associated plugin for whatever environment that you're using. But it is definitely possible to use it through the CDN, as we see here, which is pretty cool. All right, and that is going to go ahead and do it for this video on how to install Tailwind CSS. If you like this video and found this information valuable, please give me a like down below. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing. We're going to be learning a lot more about web development, including HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and everything else in between. So if that's what you're into, I would love to have you along for the journey. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, be sure to leave those down in the comments below. And until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.